fifth installment of an interview between Pope Leo and Crux's correspondent Elise and Alan, titled "Pope Leo Speaks to Crux's Elise and Alan About Polarization in the World." It was published by the Crux Staff on September 18th, 2025. And the editor's note says, "These are the fifth excerpts of a two-part interview between Pope Leo XIV and Crux senior correspondent Elise Ann Allen, contained in her new biography of the Pontiff Leon XIV, Ciudadano del Mundo, Misionero del Siglo XXI, or Leo XIV, Citizen of the World, Missionary of the 21st Century. The book is published in Spanish by Penguin Peru and will be available for the purchase in stores and online September 18th. English and Portuguese editions will be available in early 2026. Alan, the interviewer, says, "I want to follow up on that later, on the topic of artificial intelligence and the crisis you are describing, but in terms of the polarization and division you were speaking of, it's no secret that had a significant impact on Pope Francis's papacy, the criticism he faced, and how he was seen. Was there something you're worried about as you step in the same role?" Pope Leo says, "Going back to what I was seeing my role as being, I don't feel the need to complicate my role because my role is announcing the good news, preaching the gospel. I think the gospel addresses some of these questions from a basis which comes out of a sense of being sons and daughters of God, who is creator of God, who sent his son, who incarnated among us, and who taught us the value of human life, keeping an eye on eternal life. If you lose the horizon, you lose your compass. You may be wandering in vain and not knowing where to go. So in one sense, I don't see my primary role as trying to be the solver of the world's problems. I don't see my role as that at all, really, although I think that the church has a voice, a message that needs to continue to be preached, to be spoken loudly. The values of the church will promote in dealing with some of these world crises don't come out of the blue, they come out of the gospel. They come from a place that makes very clear how we understand the relationships between God and us and between one another. Going back to the very basic things of respecting one another, respecting human dignity, where does that dignity come from, and how can we use that as a way of saying that the world can be a better place and we can treat one another better? There have been periods of time when that voice has been lost or ignored or less valued. It's very interesting to see in countries like France, which for a long period of time was considered one of the most secularized countries that was around. Yesterday I met with a group of young French men and women. There were thousands last year who freely, young adults now, sought baptism. They want to come to the church because they realize that their lives are empty or are missing something or don't have meaning, and they're discovering something again that the church has to offer. Along those lines, I believe my mission has to be and is very clear in saying, where do we start? Where are we going? And then what can that message also have meaning? And how can that message also have meaning when we look at geopolitics and the kinds of situations we're talking about? And the interviewer said, unfortunately, even the gospel has become ideological today. Then he says, that's part of the polarization issue. If we fall into ideology, we're no longer talking about the real essence, the values that are there. We're becoming locked into something that, as an ideology, takes over what the real meaning is. Theology wants to use the gospel rather than saying the gospel is what we should be focusing on. It could be on both sides, or many sides in terms of the interpretation someone gives if they're not willing to re-understand the authentic message that's there. Then the interviewer said, I want to shift to something we spoke about in our previous conversation, in which you also mentioned in your first speech, and that is synodality, the synodal church. I think the concept of synodality is still something many people struggle to understand. How would you define it? And Pope Leo said, I think that synodality is an attitude and openness, a willingness to understand, speaking of the church now, that each and every member of the church has a voice and a role to play. That through prayer reflection, the method was used in the recent synod, which has been called conversation in the spirit, but through a process, and there's many ways that could happen, a dialogue and respect for one another, to bring people together and to understand that relationship, that interaction, that creating opportunities of encounter is an important dimension of how we live our life as a church, or as church. Some people have felt threatened by that. Sometimes bishops, priests might feel synodality is going to take away my authority. That's not what synodality is about. And maybe your idea of what your authority is somewhat out of focus, mistaken. I think that synodality is a way of describing how we can come together and be a community and seek communion as a church, so that it's a church whose primary focus is not on an institutional hierarchy, rather on a sense of we together, our church, each person with his or her own vocation, priests or laity or bishops, missionaries, families, everyone with a specific vocation that they've been given has a role to play and something to contribute. And together we look for the way to grow and walk together as church. As an attitude which I think could teach a lot to the world today. A little bit ago, we were talking about polarization. I think this is a sort of an antidote. I think this is a way of addressing some of the greatest challenges that we have in the world today. If we listen to the gospel, if we reflect upon it together, and if we strive to walk forward together, listening to one another, trying to discover what God is saying to us today, there's a lot to be gained for us there. I do very much hope that the process that began long ago, long before the last synod, at least in Latin America, I spoke about my experience there. Some of the Latin American churches have really contributed to the universal church. I think there's a great hope if we can continue to build on the experience of the past couple of years and find ways of being church together. not to try and transform the church to some kind of democratic government, which, if we look at many countries around the world today, democracy is not necessarily a perfect solution to everything, but respecting, understanding the life of the church for what it is and saying, we have to do this together. I think that offers a great opportunity to the church, offers an opportunity for the church to engage with the rest of the world. Since the time of the Second Vatican Council, I think that's been significant, and there's a lot to be done yet. Then the writer says, I assume you mean it could be an antidote to many of the things that we've been talking about so far, polarization, etc. Does that come from personal experience in terms of the way you did things in Chiclayo and Trujillo? Then he says, I suppose in part, I think that both personal style, my own personality, the gifts that I've been given, the way that I approach even the sense of leadership. A leader who's walking by himself isn't leading anyone, but if a leader is capable of bringing people together with himself or herself and moving forward, I think that's a lot more effective. In that sense, synodality does offer a kind of an instrument, a platform, a tool that can be very helpful within the church and also in the world.